To the bold alone, hello and welcome. Tonight we begin our rocket ride to the finish of Civilands Book 1, Crimson River, with Chapter 8, Kettle and Wake. As always, my name is Nicholas Austin, and you're listening to Tuesday Night Fiction. Let's begin.
This sound will call you spirit true. I swear I'll hear that sound in you.
Daniel was sitting inside the saloon sipping a beer with one hand and scribbling thoughtfully on a notepad he was using to keep track of his progress in Haran with the other. Every few minutes he would look up and eye the barmaid, who he found to be one fine piece of Murrieta tail. Her loose dress teased just enough to make him wonder about the curves underneath, and her wavy hair was a gold with the type of shine that would make a man greedy. If there was one thing he couldn't fault the town for, it was its women. Although they weren't as proper as those in Fayette, there was something much more exotic and exciting about them. Daniel very much looked forward to being able to take time to explore his interest a bit more. As he smoothly swallowed the last of his hoppy ale down his throat, he saw the barmaid slowly approach out of the corner of his eye. There was a purpose in her step. "I can see you eyeing me from over here, you know. And I can't say that I mind, handsome," she said flirtatiously. "How'd you like to buy me a drink with your next one?" Daniel laughed silently. "If I'm not mistaken, I'd say you must have been eyeing me too in that case. And I'm not as easy as you might think, my lady," he replied coyly. "Now you're the one who works here, so how about you go fetch them drinks and I'll maybe accept your advances. Could even pencil you in on this here busy schedule I got." She smiled and lifted her hand to her chest. "Well, I'll be damned. That's some nerve you got. My name's Joanna. But call me Joe instead of that my lady crap, if you please. I'll be right back with those drinks," she said with a wink. "Will do, Joe." Daniel smiled back as she skipped back to the bar. Maybe the exploration would start sooner than he thought. "Daniel," he was suddenly greeted from behind. Startled, he made no attempt to hide that he didn't recognize the person standing before him when he turned around. Behind this person, whose face was in terrible condition, was an uppity youngster and recent Keegan addition named Frankie Covington. Finally, with one last tilt of his head in an attempt to recognize the man, it hit him. "Colin?" Dominic asked in disbelief. "Is that you? My goodness, what happened out there?" "Yes, it's me, sir," Colin reported, looking down at his feet with his hands in his pockets. "I have very important news to share with you, Daniel." "I'm sure you do, but please, let's get your face cleaned up and bandaged first," Daniel practically begged. "Sir, we found the man who knocked me out days ago," Colin explained, ignoring the suggestion. "His name is actually Dominic Turner. When we caught up to him, he was crossing a bridge into the mountains with a native boy and two others." "How do you know it was a native boy?" Daniel asked as Joanna returned to place his drink on the table. She had one for herself in the other hand. "Joe, if you could give us a few minutes, please. But don't go nowhere far. I ain't nearly done with you." She nodded and winked again before leaving them to talk. As she went, Daniel watched her the whole way. He was dressed in white top to bottom, and as you can tell, the men you sent me with weren't lucky enough to escape the monstrous bear that little shithead sent after us, Colin continued. Their horse did have a nasty fall though, which slowed them down a lot, so I was hoping I could get back up there with a few more men to go after them. They won't be able to stop us this time, I promise, sir. I know how to take them down now. Daniel tapped his fingers on the table for a moment before chiming. "You mentioned two others that they were with?" "Yes, of course," Colin exhaled. "That's the most important news of all. One of the two was Jeannie Morrell. Lord knows how they found her, and you're sure it was Jeannie? You're sure she wasn't harmed?" Though at first Daniel figured Colin's exploits had resulted in failure, he was now pleasantly surprised. I'm nearly certain on both counts, sir, Colin quipped, bouncing and swaying on his feet. But sir, that isn't even the best part. Daniel was doubtful that there could be anything more in the world Colin McCormick could know that could be more important than Jeannie Morell's location, but he opted to humor the man a moment. And what is? Colin practically preened. You see, sir, the second person that was with her was none other than her brother, Harrison Morell. Of that, I am sure. Wait, what? Daniel shouted in disbelief. You're telling me that Harrison Morell is alive? How is that possible? I don't know how, but I promise you that he's most definitely alive, Colin cheered. Well, that is the greatest news I've heard in a long time. Adonis Morell's oldest son and heir was even more valuable than the youngest Morell. He'd paved the way even quicker for them in the north, having accompanied his father in trade dealings. 2 Morells. Daniel couldn't believe it. His brain quickly began analyzing how best to handle the news to a Keegan advantage, and began writing furiously on his pad again, trying to get his thoughts down. He'd have to get this to Billy immediately. Colin, I have an important request to make of you, he started, looking up at the battered man. After you get yourself patched up, I need you to ride south to Fayette and deliver this news to my brother personally. Take Frankie here with you as well, so that you aren't traveling alone and he can grow up a bit. I need y'all to tell Billy that as soon as Clovis is finished with the Vahani, I'll need him up here with me, so we can develop a strategy to continue our expansion north. Colin's shoulders slumped and eyes rolled like a grumpy child. But sir, there's still time to catch them now. And babysitting Frankie will only slow me down further. If I just had a few more men I could go north with and find a— No, Daniel interrupted as Frankie glared at Colin. Without a concrete plan of action, it would be a foolish waste for any of us to travel up into the mountain lands. You wouldn't catch them, nor would you survive the journey. Wanting to always maintain the support of his followers, he then assured the man. Look, I understand that this Dominic fellow insulted you, and I know you want your revenge. I can see the fire inside of you. But right now, my brothers and I need you to complete this task for us. If you do so successfully, I promise you that I'll personally give you the permission to find and do with this Dominic what you please. Will I be allowed some men to search with, sir? When the time comes in your plan? Colin asked, rather unwisely in Daniel's opinion. Daniel's kindness only went so far when it was beginning to fade. We will see when the time comes, Colin. But we simply cannot afford to risk the lives of any more of our own without a proper plan. That is final. All right then, sir, he finally conceded. I'll bring this news to Mr. William with haste. I won't let you down again. Don't worry about it, Colin, Daniel replied. Just one more thing. Before you go out to fetch your horse and make this trip, please make sure to tend to your wounds. I'm serious. It's pained me to have even had to look at your face in the condition it's in. Colin nodded. I will, he muttered. Let's go, Frankie. Thank you for the opportunity, Mr. Keegan, Frankie enthusiastically said to Daniel, who smiled back kindly. As they walked out toward the doors of the saloon, he heard the young man tell Colin, I know where we can get you wrapped up, if you want to follow me, sir. Daniel wasn't entirely sure, but as the door shut behind them, he thought he could hear Colin snidely remark, Go fuck yourself, Frankie. Daniel rolled his eyes, leaned back in his chair, and lifted his beer. Joe, he called out through the saloon. Where'd your gorgeous ass get off to? It's time to celebrate. So with Daniel working things out in Haran, a battered Colin McCormick has returned from his ambush on the comrades in the north, while Daniel continues to explore the small town. That was part 1 of 3. Let's get on to part 2. The outlook for reaching Oren's camp now seemed very bleak. With Nala gone and the trailer left behind, the group was forced to carry any essentials that they could. Dominic remained stocked with the travel supplies he thought could be helpful along the way, while the others all carried what food they had left wrapped in tent cloth. Beside these things, They had only pistols and the clothes on their backs. Left behind was extra clothing, equipment that was too much to carry, a fair amount of firewood, and several other items considered to be luxuries given their current circumstances. As for their physical condition, the cold provided no relief to anyone, though Dominic thought it might be hitting him the worst. Along with the beating he took to his face, which was covered in cuts and beginning to swell, his ribs took quite a few blows as well. Walking and breathing became a chore, as he hadn't yet had a chance to rest or recover. Despite the discomfort, though, the pain did serve as a sort of distraction from his feeling of weakness in his failure to kill Colin. With the struggles he was now facing both inside and out, simply having a chance to meditate made reaching the Mountainlands camp as soon as possible infinitely more desirable. After the altercation, he and Hansa had each struggled across the half-destroyed bridge with their respective supplies. On reaching the other side, they then distributed the loads more evenly, and left behind what they believed Nala would be carrying. Then they began down the trail, which carved a path between the massive mountains. Strangely, the angle at which they were now facing the peaks made it feel like they were in a different place entirely. Dominic recalled the landscape from before that was so visually pleasing that it seemed at any moment it could be lifted right out of sight. It had been like a canvas that filled one's eyes. However, they were now looking straight up into the heart of the beast. When focusing on the top of the mountain, Dominic felt as if he were transported to it, feeling a sense of falling, even while standing safely at the base. Though still a beautiful sight, even its previously aesthetic-pleasing characteristics were now rather haunting. "How will we make it through with so little supplies to take us there?" Jeannie asked as she stood and stared down the path. "We have no other choice," Hansa replied, echoing Dominic's earlier sentiment. With that, he began his ascent up the trail into the mountains, with the others following closely behind. As they progressed, the density of trees along the path thickened. Some were white and splintered in all directions, while others had greens and browns that still seemed to have warmth about them. By the smell of the dead wood, lightning had struck here many times before, and it had struck fiercely. The smell came to distract Dominic as he tripped on one of the stones that littered the trail. While he continued on, the thought came to him that a place like this was a true testament to the plight of the earth and its glorious response. Even in the calm and silence, with the snow falling gently, it was so alive. This was a path that was not forged any more easily than it was walked. They continued along the trail until the sun began to set. By then, the group was exhausted from a whole day of traveling mostly uphill in the snow. The snowfall was also starting to pick up, indicating that their journey would only become more challenging. "Is it a good idea to stop and rest now?" Harrison asked. Dominic's heart skipped a happy beat at the suggestion. "I believe so. We still have another few days of travel," Hansa answered. "So with the snow falling heavier now, we need to ensure we have the energy to continue tomorrow. Besides, this should be a good stopping point. Let's get to work then. This cold is becoming brutal," Dominic said, trying his best to keep the pleading out of his voice. They worked efficiently in their setup to minimize the time they would have to spend outside the shelter. In fact, they worked so well as a team that without very much communication, each of them contributed in a different and productive way to pitch the tent and stow their belongings. Once finished and inside, the group sat closely, huddled in a circle to warm themselves before going to sleep. "Can I ask you all something?" Hansa whispered with his teeth chattering. "Of course you can," Dominic replied. "Why do you people all have to leave the east to come here?" he started. "I have heard of how large your cities are and that they only continue to grow. If that is the case, why leave? Why must you all come here and terrorize our home?" Dominic paused and pondered the question, finding it as difficult to do so. He assumed by Jeannie's and Harrison's silence that they must find it just as troublesome to answer as he did. The boy certainly didn't mean to lump them in with the Keegans and the other terrible gangs. Did he? A very bold question, Dominic finally responded. "I am not sure I see how it is bold," Hansa answered. "Well, it's a little unfair to ask of us that question as if we are part of the problem, given we are helping and all," Harrison said. "Unfair? Hansa repeated. Is it not also unfair that you have your sister here beside you while mine is being led by traitors and stalked by a band of murderers? I may never see her again. I may never see any of my family again. That is what is truly unfair. And if it were not for the greed of you Easterners, it would not be that way at all. We come because for some of us the big cities grow too tall, Dominic replied, and he recognized Hansa's expression shift away from anger to inquisition. In time, they become so vast that it is as if you could get swallowed whole within them. The high-rises, the crowded streets, the smell of concrete and human piss and shit in the alleyways. It becomes too much. It all used to make me feel so low. And yet when I was there, the city itself was my only friend. I used to try to tell myself it inspired me, but it was all just a lie. And what it came down to was I just wasn't entirely free there. Once a place has grown beyond the scope of a person's ability to comprehend building upon it, I suppose it just loses its meaning. It is lost in the masses. And for some, like our father, that can be a good thing, Harrison seemed determined to add. Hansa stared idly at the three of them. To Dominic, it appeared that Hansa wanted to understand but just couldn't. Their backgrounds certainly were very different, but they were brought together by greater forces that would need to disregard those differences, not emphasize them if they were to succeed. I think it would be best for me to just get some rest, Hansa declared as he hunched over to sleep. The others followed suit soon after, and Dominic slept that night as well as he could have, considering how cold it was becoming, even inside their tent. When they woke, the clouds remained in the sky, and conditions continued to deteriorate. They traveled along the trail for another day, which, once again, went relatively well. The path was beginning to become icy, and they did have the occasional slip at times. But otherwise, their greatest worry was keeping warm. That evening, once they made camp again, they also decided to gather wood to build a fire, which provided great relief. Once again, Dominic rested easy through the night. This time, when morning came, he could see the sun rising. The clouds finally dispersed. Once his things were packed, he marveled at the way its rays hugged the cliffs. Though there was a building fog, this morning finally felt pleasant. Dominic watched as Harrison approached his sister and put his arm around her. I wish Donovan could see this, Jeannie said quietly in response. He can, sister. I'm sure he can, Harrison replied. How his heart ached for these surviving Morels. Just then, howling filled the air. The group froze at first before racing toward each other and standing in a tight-knit formation. Hounds? Jeannie cried. Oh, please don't let it be hounds again. Worse, Hansa whispered as the sounds grew louder. Those are wolf calls. By the sound of it, a pack. Maybe about 4 of them or so. Can your people not speak to them, Hansa? Jeannie asked. Can you not tell them to pass? Dominic had the same thought, hope rising in him, even as the calls grew nearer. Unfortunately, we cannot, he regretfully replied. Wolves cannot be tamed. Our words have no meaning to a hungry wolf. It would be best to prepare your weapons now. Damn it, Dominic muttered under his breath, careful to not let the children hear the fear in his voice. He drew his pistol, looking in every direction in anticipation of the coming threat. Sure enough, a pack of 5 wolves finally emerged from different parts of the foggy tree line. They began to snarl angrily as they stared down the intruders in their territory. Should we shoot? Jeannie whispered, her gun arm shaking. Hold on, there are too many, Dominic replied as the beasts made their creeping approach. By the time we get 4 shots off, one of them will still be upon us even if we're lucky enough to down the others. His focus never left the pack, which seemed ready to strike. So what should we do? Harrison mumbled. Dominic's eyes raced around until he landed upon a plan. Out of the corner of his mouth, he answered, Only when I say now will you shoot. Until then, we won't have the advantage. Ready yourselves and aim for the kill. They waited, but much to Dominic's dismay, Jeannie's shaking hand accidentally fired a shot. The bullet pierced the shoulder of her target. At first there was a whimper, and the wolves paused, but with ferocity they leaped forward into a charge, even the injured wolf joining in the run after a moment. "Now!" Dominic shouted, desperately reaching into the pocket of his coat. He and the boys fired their weapons while Jeannie tried to reload. Then Dominic grabbed the smoke bomb from his pocket and threw it straight to the ground in front of him. A shroud of smoke began to cover them. Jeannie, Harrison, and Hansa all stopped reloading their weapons and beheld what was occurring around them. Dominic cast a glance around through the smoke. He and the boys had taken their shots from much closer range and hit their targets with kill shots. So now only 2 wolves remained, including the injured one. Dominic realized that because of the early shot, they would not be completely submerged in the smoke fast enough to avoid the remaining attackers outright, as had been his original intention. In a split-second decision, he grabbed the others, pulling them to a knee on the ground and covering them under their thick tent sheet. "Don't move!" he shouted just as the wolves pounced into the smoke. Fortunately, without visibility, the weakened animals landed awkwardly, missing their targets. The injured wolf could be heard whimpering more dramatically now as the final remaining wolf began biting and clawing at the sheet. "What do we do?" Harrison yelled. Activity from inside their cover was frantic as they attempted to fend off the threat. Then Hansa let out a horrid scream. The wolf's jaws had bit straight down into his forearm through the sheet. Once it had him, it began heaving back and forth violently, removing the others from the cover. As Dominic emerged from the sheet, the smoke was now so thick that it was impossible to see through, and he soon realized that Hansa and the wolf were no longer with them. Hansa's screaming persisted as Dominic, Jeannie, and Harrison crawled feverishly around to find him. In a moment, Jeannie disappeared as well. Harrison looked up at Dominic. "Jeannie?" Harrison called out. "Jeannie!" A pistol shot rang out, silencing all the yelling and snarling, and Dominic felt his stomach bottom out. When the smoke had finally cleared, he saw Jeannie kneeling over Hansa. Dominic beheld the sight of the slain wolves and felt himself quaking from the inside out. The trauma was beginning to take a toll. Once he collected himself, he looked toward the others. Harrison had run over to his sister and was kneeling next to her. "I'm sorry," Jeannie shouted as tears poured from her eyes. "It's all my fault. I'm so sorry." Dominic could not see Hansa from his position behind Jeannie, so he rushed over and gently nudged her aside. There on the ground, the bloodied Hansa lay completely still. His contorted forearm was badly broken, which made Dominic suck in a breath and, for the first time in a long time, pray. So that was part 2 of 3 of what is honestly one of my favorite chapters in this book. In part 2, we got to see Dominic's illusionist abilities even further as the comrades struggle through their journey up the mountainlands. As Game of Thrones would say, winter has already come for them. Well, let's continue on to part 3 and finish this chapter off with a bang. The Vahani had finally exhausted all of the available food that they had been left at the abandoned Tokali camp, and were now preparing to continue traveling toward the hold. Latera avoided eye contact with Elon completely since their confrontation. It continued to frustrate her a great deal that he could so quickly shy away from the trust and friendship they'd forged. But standing up to him had helped to ease some of the anger she felt. The more she thought about it, the more she could understand the challenges he must have been going through. He seemed unable to remove his romantic feelings from their friendship, and while she struggled not to feel more, she felt the loss of the friendship the harshest. Yet, considering the differences between their people, perhaps even a true friendship between them was too much to ask, let alone anything else. This journey had been a long one already, and was not nearly over. While she wished that she hadn't lost the person that had become her closest friend along the way, she knew that first and foremost she had to continue to lead. While she prepared the last of her things, she finally had one of the Vahani women fix her hair. Rather than her typical braid, Latera was ready for a change. The woman ultimately cut her hair at her shoulders and tightly braided it into a crown. When it was finished, she felt brand new, at least until Elon abruptly approached her. In stark contrast to his previously uncertain demeanor, Elon now stood tall and firm as he asked, "Latera, do you have a moment? I want to apologize, and I would like to talk with you if you will let me. I've not been honest with you or myself, but I would very much like to try and start." Without a word, she nodded her assent. Great, he replied. If we can go find a place to be alone, I will explain. The two wandered off as Latera followed him away from the camp, wondering what he would say. Eventually they came to a trail through a wooded area that took them out of sight. The trail led to a barren field that stood at the bottom of the same tall hill that she had scaled earlier. As Elon looked up to the top, she couldn't help but smirk. She nearly bumped into him as he abruptly stopped, turning to speak to her. Just as he opened his mouth, however, he began squinting at something ahead. He pointed to it. "Do you see that?" he asked. She did see something ahead, a figure of some kind. "Yes. What is it?" They began walking a little further down the slope plane toward it. When they got close enough, Latera noticed that it was a man with a pistol in his hand. "Who is there and what are you doing out here?" Elon called to the man. With a start, the man turned around. It was Castor, and he was now as pale as his clothing. "Oh," he excitedly sighed. "Elon and Latera. Hi. It is just me." Neither she nor Elon said anything. I just came out for, or maybe not." He looked up at the sky with a deep breath and continued. "There was a time when I used to live in the mountain lands. When I did, there was a Vahini man who was going through a very hard time and was depressed. One afternoon, while a group of us were hiking up in the hills, we spotted him alone. Before we could reach him, though, he jumped over the ledge. The most unfortunate part of the story, though, was not that he jumped, but that he survived the fall. When we found him at the bottom, he could not move at all. We could see the life fading from him with each passing second. But almost as if to punish him, it would not leave him entirely. Seeing his pain, we asked him if he wished for us to kill him out of mercy. We were dumbfounded when he declined. The reason he gave us, though, was at the instant he jumped from the ledge, he was overcome with regret. All his troubles had vanished in that moment, as he realized how valuable his life was. So, as he lay there on the ground with his body broken, he told us that he felt fortunate to feel the pain that he was feeling. Latera noticed a state of stillness descend over her. She felt nothing. No reaction was forthcoming, as if this moment was inevitable, and she was only waiting for it to finish playing out before her. "What does this story have to do with you?" Elon asked sharply. Castor looked at Latera and explained. "Only that when I did what I did, and I could see it in your eyes that you know what that is, I felt the same thing that man felt when he jumped. I felt immediate regret when I pulled that trigger. And I now stand here in the same condition emotionally that the man who jumped was in physically. I am utterly broken now. Unlike him, though, my actions nullified the value of my life, rather than revealing it to me." With that, he looked down for a moment or two and began to weep. "There are pieces of things inside me that have splintered off. Love, respect, honor. Things that I used to defend and hold dear. I remember I used to look down at my shadow and see how tall it stood as a way to measure them, to measure myself, to tell myself how much of a man I had become. But now I cast no shadow, and all those pieces have faded away. Please, just grant me one thing," he cried. "I beg for nothing else but your forgiveness. Please." Latera felt the urgent look Elon shot her but ignored it. She refused to relinquish Castor's fear without his having earned it. "Latera?" Elon pleaded. With her stare, Castor continued to sob. It was as if she was communicating her betrayal to him without saying a word, and after all this time, he still didn't know what to say. "I am sorry," he whispered to her. In that moment, she had accepted his fate as much as he had, and she felt a deep disappointment. She knew that his apology was hollow, and if he were truly sorry, then he'd help her to save their people, as Arcuda would have wanted. Even now, he had the opportunity to do so, but the coward simply couldn't. Then, he lifted his pistol to his head and pulled the trigger. Latera flinched for the slightest instant as her gaze followed his lifeless body to the ground. Elon fell to his knees beside her. Breathing heavily, he uttered, What just... Elon said nothing further, but even if he had, she was not sure she would have stopped in that moment to hear him. Latera had decided it was time to act. She lifted her hands to her mouth then, and called up to the wind. Elon's eyes widened as the words came out. Soon after she had made her call, a group of vultures flew into view overhead. Latera was patient, allowing the group to circle their meal below. Every minute of this ritual was intentional. She wanted Elon there to witness it, to see if he would protest, to see where his allegiance fell. But he said nothing. Finally, after giving him every opportunity to stop her, she gave a command and the scavengers descended upon Castor's body. Latera was once again still, watching without either pleasure or disgust as they tore away at the flesh of her father's killer. Elon, on the other hand, began heaving until he could hold it no longer and vomited on the ground below his feet. Once Elon collected himself, Latera turned her attention toward him. "Tell me, Elon, what is it you wanted to talk about?" As Elon proceeded to shamefully look away, she realized that no answer would come. With one last look at the gruesome scene before her, she marched toward the feasting vultures. There was no fear in her stride. Beside them, she spotted Castor's revolver, which he promptly lifted and tucked away. With that, she turned to head back toward the camp, glancing up once again at the rocky hill she had climbed. And that'll do it for my favorite chapter of Crimson River, Chapter 8, Kettle and Wake. Thanks as always for listening in. If you really enjoyed this episode, feel free to like, share, and subscribe on whatever podcatcher you like, or if you're watching on YouTube, do the same thing there. If you'd like to support this audiobook podcast, it is based on written books, which are available in ebook and paperback on Amazon, so you can go there and purchase yourself a copy or copies, because it is a series. Books 1 to 3 are available right now. Book 4 should be available in the next month or so, with a tentative release date of July 23rd. I'm super excited for Book 4, Cryptic Kingdom. So excited, in fact, that I'm going to be doing a massive giveaway. So 10 winners are going to get all 4 books in the Civilands series, signed copies, sent right to their door. All you have to do is follow me on Instagram. Keep an eye out for their giveaway post. And it's going to be as simple as tagging a fellow friend who likes to read. That'll enter you immediately. And since there's 10 winners, you will most likely be one of them. So get on your Instagram and follow today if you want to win a bunch of books. As I've mentioned countless times before, I'm very open to feedback on this podcast. If you've read the books in the series and you enjoyed them immensely, go ahead and go on Amazon and leave a review. Or if you just want to tell me how the podcast is going, if you have any opinions or thoughts or responses to anything I've already talked about, go ahead and go on my contact form at nvaustinbooks.com. Let me know what you're thinking. For now, I want to wish a happy 4th of July to everyone. I want to say thanks again for listening in. I greatly appreciate the support. And I hope you're as hyped as I am for Cryptic Kingdom. It's going to be epic. Next week, I'll be back to do the recap episode. But for now, my name's Nicholas Austin. This has been Tuesday Night Fiction, and I'll talk to you next Tuesday.
The sound will call with spirit true. I swear I'll hear that sound in you.
The Tuesday Night Fiction podcast, the Civilands series, and the musical score for the podcast are all produced